Right now, somewhere over the southern flank of Iran, a jet that the United States Air Force has been trying to kill for years is doing something nobody expected. It is hunting warships. It is killing drones. It is flying combat patrols over the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow choke point through which nearly a fifth of the world's oil supply passes every single day, and it is doing it armed with laser-guided rockets, Maverick missiles, and its legendary 30mm cannon. The aircraft is the A-10 Thunderbolt II. The jet the Pentagon wanted to retire in fiscal year 2026 is writing its combat legacy in real time, in a real war, against a real adversary, in one of the most strategically critical waterways on Earth. This is the story of the Warthog. In June of 2025, the United States launched one of the most complex and audacious military operations in recent history. Operation Midnight Hammer was a 36-hour mission that began at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri and ended with 7 B-2 Spirit stealth bombers delivering 14 30,000-pound bunker buster bombs onto 3 of Iran's most fortified underground nuclear facilities: Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. The operation came at the tail end of what became known as the 12-Day War, a conflict that began when Israel launched surprise airstrikes against Iran on June 13, 2025, targeting Iranian air defense infrastructure, radar networks, and missile systems. By the time American bombers entered Iranian airspace on June 22, Israel had already spent days systematically dismantling the Russian-supplied S-300 missile batteries and the domestically produced Bavar 373 systems that Iran had spent billions of dollars building over the previous 2 decades. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, described what happened when the American strike package executed its mission. The B-2s flew east across the Atlantic, crossed into Iranian airspace alongside 4th and 5th generation fighter escorts, employed deception tactics including electronic decoys and high-speed feints, and delivered their payload in what officials called the largest B-2 operational strike in United States history. Iran's fighters did not fly. Its surface-to-air missile systems, according to Kane, did not see the strike package coming. 6 of the 7 bombers dropped 12 massive ordnance penetrator bombs on Fordow. The 7th dropped 2 on Natanz. A submarine operating inside the United States Central Command Area of Responsibility launched more than 24 Tomahawk cruise missiles against Isfahan simultaneously. By the morning of June 22, all 3 sites had sustained what Kane described as extremely severe damage and destruction. The nuclear program that Iran had built over decades, hidden underground, reinforced with concrete and steel, buried beneath mountains, was effectively finished. But Midnight Hammer was only the beginning. What came next, and what is still ongoing as of early 2026, is a broader American air campaign called Operation Epic Fury. And this is where the A-10 re-enters the story in the most unexpected way. With Iran's air defense network dismantled first by Israeli strikes, and then by American precision weapons, the threat environment over Iranian-controlled airspace shifted dramatically. The layered missile defense network that had made Iranian airspace so dangerous was gone. What remained were smaller, more diffuse threats: man-portable air defense systems, fast-attack watercraft, drone swarms, and surface naval assets that Iran was attempting to use to close the Strait of Hormuz to commercial shipping. Iran's parliament voted to authorize the closure of the strait in the hours after Midnight Hammer, and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was actively deploying fast boats, kamikaze uncrewed surface vessels, and shore-based assets to enforce that closure. Iran had for decades invested in asymmetric maritime capabilities precisely for this scenario, the ability to threaten the strait even when outmatched in conventional air and naval power. These are precisely the kinds of targets the A-10 was born to hunt. On March 19, 2026, Chairman Kane confirmed at a Pentagon press briefing that A-10 Warthogs were now operating across the southern flank of Iran, hunting and destroying Iranian fast-attack watercraft in the Strait of Hormuz. Apache attack helicopters were flying similar missions nearby. The fact that these platforms, slow, unstealthy, designed for low-altitude knife fights, could operate in that environment at all, said everything about the state of Iranian air defenses. When stealth is no longer necessary, when the battlefield has been suppressed to the point where persistence and payload matter more than speed and radar cross-section, you want the A-10. Images from these deployments released by United States Central Command showed Warthogs loaded with Advanced Precision Kill Weapon System 2 rockets, AGM-65 Maverick air-to-surface missiles, and AIM-9 Sidewinder air-to-air missiles, a loadout designed to handle everything from fast-moving surface targets to drone threats in a single sortie. And the drone kills were not theoretical. Earlier in the conflict, at least one A-10 deployed in the Middle East had been photographed with kill markings depicting Shahed-style one-way attack drones on its fuselage. The aircraft, nicknamed Ares, had also employed a small-diameter bomb and its 30mm cannon during the same deployment, demonstrating a range of capability that the retirement paperwork being drafted back in Washington gave the aircraft no credit for. Beyond the confirmed kills, the deployment revealed a capability in the A-10 that its advocates had been pointing to for years, but that rarely made it into the retirement debate. The aircraft's extended loiter time means that a pair of Warthogs can maintain a persistent combat air patrol over a maritime choke point for hours at a time, identifying and engaging threats as they emerge, rather than arriving, delivering, and departing in the 2 to 3 minute window available to a fast jet. In the Strait of Hormuz, where Revolutionary Guard fastboats operate in cluttered littoral waters amid commercial shipping, tankers, and other surface traffic, the ability to positively identify a threat before engaging is not optional. It is a legal and moral requirement. The A-10, with its targeting pod, its low and slow loiter capability, and its mix of precision-guided and direct fire weapons, is extraordinarily well suited to that environment. This maritime warfare role was not a recent improvisation. The aircraft is trained for Persian Gulf scenarios specifically for decades. In 2011, during Operation Unified Protector over Libya, an A-10 and a Navy P-3C Orion worked together to engage patrol boats and small attack craft in the port of Misrata. Through the 2010s and into the 2020s, A-10 units conducted regular maritime surface warfare exercises. In September of 2023, two A-10s engaged simulated surface threats in the Gulf of Oman alongside an Arleigh Burke-class guided missile destroyer. In 2024, a formation of 6 A-10Cs from Moody Air Force Base escorted an Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine during a live-fire exercise in the Strait of San Juan de Fuca, conducting live gun and rocket fire while providing overwatch for one of the most vulnerable phases of a nuclear submarine's navigation. When the call came to put Warthogs over the Strait of Hormuz in Operation Epic Fury, the pilots had a playbook they had been rehearsing for years. The irony is almost too perfect. Even as Congress and the Pentagon were debating whether to retire the last 162 A-10s in fiscal year 2026, the aircraft was flying its most operationally diverse combat missions in decades. Close air support, counter-drone, and maritime surface warfare, all in the same deployment, at a cost per flight hour dramatically below every available alternative. The Warthog proved something in Iran that its advocates have argued for a generation. The right question is not whether the A-10 can survive in a high-threat environment against a near-peer adversary with fully operational integrated air defenses. It cannot, and nobody seriously claims it can. The right question is what happens after those defenses have been suppressed by stealth aircraft, long-range missiles, and electronic warfare. The answer, demonstrated live over the Strait of Hormuz in 2026, is that you want the A-10. You want its loiter time, its weapons load, its cannon, its ability to take a hit and keep flying, and its operating cost that is a fraction of any alternative. There is another dimension to the Iran deployment that the Pentagon has been reluctant to fully acknowledge. The A-10 was not only performing its traditional close air support role, it was demonstrating something that air power theorists have spent decades arguing the aircraft could not do. It was operating effectively in a dynamic, multi-domain environment alongside fifth-generation aircraft, unmanned systems, and naval forces, contributing precision effects to a joint campaign in ways that its Cold War design had not originally envisioned. The pilots flying over the Strait of Hormuz were not executing a 1977 tactics manual. They were integrating Link 16 targeting data from other aircraft, receiving coordinates from naval vessels tracking Iranian surface contacts by radar, employing precision weapons that did not exist when the aircraft was designed, and contributing to a kill chain that stretched from satellites and signals intelligence through airborne early warning aircraft down to the Warthog's targeting pod and weapons release. The aircraft was old, the mission was entirely modern. One A-10 was lost during the Iran campaign. The pilot of a Warthog that sustained damage during an operation to support the rescue of downed F-15 crew members inside Iran had to eject over the country after the aircraft became unflyable. The pilot was recovered. The aircraft was not. It was, as of early 2026, the first confirmed combat loss of an A-10 in more than 2 decades. And it happened during a rescue mission, a role the aircraft had performed since Vietnam, protecting downed aviators until helicopters could reach them. The loss did not stop operations. The remaining A-10s continued flying missions the following day. The retirement debate reached a certain dark irony when news of the combat loss emerged. Here was an aircraft the Air Force had been declaring obsolete and vulnerable since the early 1990s, confirming with the combat loss that yes, in a contested enough environment, the A-10 can be shot down. And the Air Force response was precisely what the retirement advocates had always said it should be: retire the aircraft because it cannot survive. The advocates of the Warthog responded as they always have: point to the missions the aircraft completed before it was lost, the armor it destroyed, the pilots it protected, the boots on the ground it supported. Both arguments are correct within their own frame of reference. The aircraft is vulnerable in high-threat environments. The aircraft is irreplaceable in low-threat environments. The Air Force wants to fight in high-threat environments. The Army wants close air support in whatever environment the war happens to be. Now let us understand why. The A-10 Thunderbolt II is, in the simplest terms, a flying gun. Everything about its design philosophy begins and ends with the cannon it carries, and everything else works outward from there. That cannon is the General Electric GAU-8 Avenger, a 7-barrel hydraulically driven rotary autocannon that fires 30mm armor-piercing rounds at a rate of either 1,800 or 4,200 rounds per minute, selectable by the pilot. The gun is so large and so powerful that it essentially defines the front third of the aircraft. The cannon and its ammunition drum system together weigh nearly 4,000 pounds, more than an empty light aircraft. The depleted uranium alloy armor-piercing rounds it fires are nearly 12 inches long and weigh close to 1.5 pounds each. A 1.5-second burst fires approximately 65 to 100 rounds depending on the rate selected. The published effective range against ground armor is around 4,000 feet, though combat experience has seen it employed at much closer distances. Against armored vehicles, the depleted uranium penetrators defeat the top armor of virtually all main battle tanks that existed when the aircraft entered service, and many that have been fielded since. The recoil force when the GAU-8 fires at full rate is approximately 10,000 pounds, roughly equal to the thrust of one of the aircraft's 2 engines. Pilots describe the sensation in a shallow dive as a noticeable deceleration with every burst, as if the aircraft itself is trying to stop in midair to let the cannon catch up to the target. The gun is mounted on the aircraft's centerline to minimize yaw torque, which required the nose wheel to be offset slightly to starboard. One of dozens of design compromises the GAU-8 forced on the rest of the airframe. The nose gear sits to the right of centerline. The left main gear has a slightly different geometry than the right. Every visible asymmetry on the front of the A-10 traces back to the decision to put the gun on the centerline, which was itself a decision driven by the desire to make the gun as accurate as possible. The A-10 carries 11 hardpoints, 8 under the wings and 3 under the fuselage, capable of carrying a combined weapons payload of 16,000 pounds. That figure exceeds the maximum bomb load carried by a B-17 Flying Fortress on most World War II missions. The aircraft can carry virtually the full inventory of American air-to-ground precision-guided munitions, including the AGM-65 Maverick and multiple guidance variants for standoff attacks on armor and structures, the GBU-12 Paveway 2 laser-guided bomb, the GBU-54 laser joint direct attack munition, the GBU-31 GPS-guided bomb, the GBU-39 small-diameter bomb, the CBU-87 combined effects munition, the CBU-97 sensor-fused weapon, and the advanced precision. For self-defense and drone engagement, the AIM-9 Sidewinder provides a genuine infrared-guided missile capability against slow-moving aerial threats. The standard combat load for close air support includes 1,174 rounds of 30mm ammunition in the gun drum, and a mission-specific mix of Maverick missiles and rockets appropriate to the expected target set. The airframe is built around survivability in a way that no other aircraft in American service has ever replicated. The cockpit is enclosed in a titanium armor bathtub approximately 1¼ inches thick, weighing around 1,200 pounds, designed to protect the pilot from projectiles up to 23 millimeters in caliber fired from virtually any angle. The hydraulic flight control systems are fully redundant, two completely independent systems, either of which can fly the aircraft alone. If both are destroyed, the aircraft is designed to be controlled on manual reversion, meaning direct mechanical linkages to the flight surfaces that require more physical effort from the pilot but allow the aircraft to be flown to a survivable landing. The engines, two General Electric TF-34GE-100 turbofans, rated at 9,065 pounds of thrust each, are mounted high on the rear fuselage and external pods, positioned above and behind the wing. This placement does several important things simultaneously. It shields the engines from ground fire directed upward through the aircraft. It keeps engine exhaust directed away from infrared-guided missiles approaching from below and behind. It allows the aircraft to operate from unimproved surfaces without ingesting runway debris that would destroy a conventional buried intake. And it means that a fire in one engine is far less likely to spread to the other or to the fuselage than in a conventional arrangement. The fuel system uses self-sealing tanks and fire-retardant foam to suppress explosion and leakage if punctured by small arms or fragmentary damage. The landing gear is deliberately oversized and deliberately protrudes slightly, even when fully retracted, so that a gear-up landing results in the aircraft resting on its gear stubs rather than on its belly, minimizing structural damage and allowing the aircraft to be recovered and repaired rather than written off. The control surfaces are designed for graceful degradation. Losing one stabilizer or an aileron reduces but does not eliminate control authority. The twin vertical tail configuration provides redundancy that a single tail design cannot. Losing one vertical stabilizer leaves the other to maintain directional control. Cases of extreme battle damage survival are documented across every major A-10 deployment. One famous Desert Storm example saw a Warthog return to base missing most of one engine, with a hole in the fuselage large enough to walk through, hydraulics shot out, and avionics partially dead. The pilot flew it several hundred miles to a recovery airfield and landed. This kind of survival story is not unusual in A-10 lore. It is common enough that maintainers developed field repair procedures for damage that would normally require factory-level work, and those procedures were used repeatedly in combat. Aerodynamically, the A-10 is the opposite of every other jet in the American inventory. Its maximum speed at sea level is approximately 420 miles per hour, or roughly Mach 0.56. It cannot exceed the speed of sound at any altitude. A fully loaded F-35A flies at more than twice that speed. But that slowness is entirely intentional. The A-10 was designed to operate at low altitude and low airspeed, because that is where close air support actually happens. Ground troops calling for fire support are in terrain, in structures, in contact with the enemy at ranges measured in meters rather than miles. They need an aircraft that can identify their position, identify the enemy position, distinguish between them in complex terrain, deliver accurate fire on the correct target, assess effects, and re-engage if necessary. A jet passing at 600 miles per hour covers a mile every 6 seconds. The pilot has perhaps 2 to 4 seconds of useful weapons employment time on a single pass. The A-10 can pull off, circle, reacquire, and make another pass within a minute. That is not a design compromise. It is the fundamental requirement the aircraft was designed to meet. The straight-wing design, unusual for any jet of any generation, generates high lift at low airspeed and gives the aircraft exceptional maneuverability at the altitudes and speeds where it operates. The large control surfaces and relatively high thrust-to-drag ratio at low speed allow aggressive, evasive maneuvering to defeat shoulder-fired infrared missiles. The aircraft can fly nap of the Earth profiles along terrain features to mask its approach, pop up to acquire a target, execute the attack, and return to terrain masking in a continuous sequence that ground-based air defense systems struggle to track and engage. In competitive exercises comparing the A-10 to other aircraft in the close air support role, the Warthog's combination of loiter time, weapons variety, accuracy at low altitude, and ability to absorb hits has consistently placed it at the top of every metric that matters to the troops receiving the support. The aircraft entered service as the A-10A with a relatively basic avionics suite, analog instruments, inertial navigation, a heads-up display, and capability to employ unguided bombs, rockets, and the Maverick missile. Over time, incremental upgrades added navigation improvements, radar warning receivers, and limited precision weapon capability. The fundamental transformation came with the Precision Engagement Upgrade and the full A-10C configuration, a program that began in 2005 and was applied progressively across the entire surviving fleet over the following decade. The A-10C introduced a fully digital glass cockpit, replacing all original analog gauges. The integrated flight and fire control computer handled precision-guided munitions release solutions that the older system could not compute. Hands-on throttle and stick controls allowed management of weapons and sensors without removing hands from the flight controls. The Lightning Advanced Targeting Pod became standard, providing a high-definition dual-mode infrared and television sensor, a laser rangefinder and designator, a laser spot tracker, and a charged couple-device camera capable of identifying vehicle markings and individual personnel at ranges well beyond weapons employment distance. Digital stores management replaced the old manual system. Link 16 data link integration allowed the aircraft to receive and transmit real-time targeting and situational awareness data across a networked force. Night vision goggle compatibility was added throughout, and the full suite of modern precision-guided munitions, GPS bombs, laser bombs, small-diameter bombs, enhanced Maverick variants, became available in a single aircraft. The result was an aircraft that looked identical on the outside to what had entered service in 1977, but was, from the cockpit and systems perspective, a genuinely modern precision strike platform. The same titanium bathtub, the same GAU-8, the same engines and airframe, but with sensors, weapons, and connectivity comparable in many respects to those of fifth-generation aircraft. The A-10C could deliver a GPS-guided bomb through a specific window in a specific building, simultaneously track a separate target with the infrared pod, pass coordinates over Link 16 to another aircraft, and maintain communication with the Joint Terminal Attack Controller on the ground calling in the strike. All of this from an airframe that had first flown in prototype form in May of 1972. The Advanced Precision Kill Weapon System 2 deserves particular attention because it changed the A-10's relevance more dramatically than almost any other single upgrade in the aircraft's final decade. APKWS II is a guidance kit, a mid-body seeker assembly that attaches to a standard 2.75-inch unguided folding fin aerial rocket and converts it into a semi-active laser-guided precision weapon with a circular error probable of approximately 1 meter. The cost per round is a fraction of a Hellfire missile. The A-10 can carry up to 210 of them across multiple rocket pods. The effect in the counter-drone mission became obvious across Middle East deployments. A slow-moving Shahed-style one-way attack drone, flying a low-altitude trajectory toward a defended target, is an extremely difficult intercept for a fast jet that must manage closure rate, set up a weapons solution, and execute in seconds. For an A-10 loitering in the area, the same drone is a target to be acquired with the targeting pod, designated with the laser, and engaged with a 1-meter accurate rocket at minimal cost. The Falco configuration of APKWS II, with its proximity fuse modified for aerial targets, made this even more effective. Multiple Warthogs in Middle East operations between 2023 and 2026 accumulated drone kill markings that would have seemed implausible when the aircraft was being dismissed in Air Force budget submissions as too old to be useful. The countermeasures suite on a fully equipped A-10C includes the ANALQ-131 or ANALQ-184 electronic countermeasures pod for radar jamming and deception, the ANAL-47 countermeasures dispensing system for chaff and flare against radar and infrared guided missiles, and a radar warning receiver providing 360-degree threat detection. The combination of physical survivability features and electronic countermeasures gives the aircraft a genuine ability to operate and survive in environments where simple analysis would suggest it should be too vulnerable, as demonstrated in every combat deployment from the Gulf War to Iran. Now the question the Air Force has been grappling with since the early 2000s must finally be answered. If not the A-10, then what? The official answer from the United States Air Force is the F-35A Lightning II. The fifth-generation multi-role stealth fighter is the designated primary replacement for the A-10 in the close air support mission. The Air Force is not wrong to make that argument in the threat environments it most cares about. Contested, high-threat airspace against near-peer adversaries with modern integrated air defense networks. The F-35A is dramatically more survivable in those environments. Its low observable shaping, its active electronically scanned array radar, designated the ANAPG-81, its distributed aperture system providing full spherical infrared awareness around the aircraft, and its electro-optical targeting system give the pilot situational awareness the A-10 pilot cannot match. It can prosecute targets in denied airspace where an A-10 would be engaged and destroyed within minutes of entering the threat envelope. Its top speed of Mach 1.6 and its supersonic dash capability give it options for egress and threat avoidance that the subsonic Warthog does not have. The F-35A carries an internal 25mm GAU-22 A4-barrel rotary cannon as its gun armament, though with only 182 rounds, less than 3 seconds of fire at the weapon's maximum cyclic rate, compared to the A-10's 1,174 combat load of 30mm. Internal weapons bays carry up to 5,000 pounds of precision-guided munitions in a stealth configuration, and external hardpoints add significant payload when operating in non-contested environments. The Block 4 software and hardware configuration, the most current standard being fielded, has expanded weapons and sensor capabilities considerably. And Israel's combat use of the F-35 Ayadir variant in the strikes that preceded Operation Midnight Hammer demonstrated that the aircraft can penetrate sophisticated air defense networks and execute precision strikes with zero losses against adversaries with genuinely capable surface-to-air missile systems, a capability the A-10 simply does not have. But the critics raise legitimate points that have not been answered in 30 years of debate. The F-35A was not designed to loiter at low altitude for hours while absorbing ground fire and waiting for a ground controller to identify a target in complex terrain. Its gun carries a payload suitable for a brief engagement rather than the extended firing runs and repeated passes that define close air support as ground troops experience it. At approximately $25,000 per flight hour in operational service, the F-35A costs roughly twice the A-10C to operate per hour in the missions where stealth provides no advantage. In a low-threat environment where what matters is time over target, weapons load, and cost per engagement, the F-35A is spending its survivability budget on a threat that does not exist, and charging that expense to every hour of every flight. The F-15EX Eagle II provides another part of the replacement picture. As a 4.5-generation heavy fighter with external stores capacity approaching 29,000 pounds, the Eagle II can carry an enormous payload of precision-guided munitions. It has received the most current avionics updates available in the American inventory and can be employed across a broader range of mission sets than the A-10. Deployed A-10 units in South Korea were replaced in part by upgraded F-16s rather than A-10 successors, reflecting the reality that in the Indo-Pacific theater, the A-10's survivability limitations against North Korean and Chinese air defense systems make it essentially unusable in the primary contingency scenarios. For Special Operations Forces, the answer has already arrived. In April of 2025, the first operational OA-1K Skyraider II was delivered to Hurlburt Field in Florida. The Skyraider II is the winning platform from the United States Special Operations Command Armed Overwatch Competition, a program launched to field an affordable, rugged, light attack and intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance aircraft for use in permissive environments where speed and stealth are irrelevant but persistence, payload, and operating costs determine mission success. The aircraft is derived from the air tractor AT-800-2, a large single-engine turboprop used commercially in agricultural and aerial firefighting applications. L3 Harris modified the platform into a military configuration designated the AT-802U Skywarden, which won the Armed Overwatch competition in August of 2022 over competing designs including the Beechcraft AT-6 Wolverine, the Embraer A-29 Super Tucano, and the PZLM-28B Bryza. The contract was approximately $3 billion for 75 aircraft to be delivered by 2029, though the program of record has been subject to a Government Accountability Office recommendation to slow procurement pending further analysis of requirements, with the current budgeted quantity at 62 aircraft. The OA-1K carries composite ballistic armor for crew protection, an electro-optical and infrared targeting system for target acquisition and designation, and hardpoints for precision air-to-ground missiles, laser-guided 70mm rockets, joint direct attack munition-guided bombs, and sensors for intelligence and reconnaissance missions. It operates from unpaved dirt runways with minimal support infrastructure. It can be disassembled, loaded into a C-17, flown anywhere in the world, and reassembled and flying within a day of arrival. Its maximum operating altitude is currently approximately 18,000 feet, with an ongoing upgrade effort to raise the ceiling to 25,000 feet. Its turboprop engine provides endurance measured in many hours rather than the short windows available to jet aircraft. Air Force Special Operations Command named it the Skyraider II in February of 2025, honoring the legacy of the Douglas A-1 Skyraider that had flown close air support in Korea and Vietnam, the very aircraft whose retirement in the 1960s had created the gap that led to the A-10 program. The Skyraider II is explicitly not intended to operate against sophisticated air defense systems or modern fighter aircraft. Its commanders have said that clearly. What it does is fill the mission space that has consumed the majority of American air power employment over the past 3 decades, supporting forces in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, the Sahel, and wherever else the United States military finds itself conducting counterinsurgency, counterterrorism, or advisory support in environments where the enemy lacks integrated air defenses. In those environments, deploying an F-35 at $25,000 per flight hour to kill a pickup truck is a catastrophically inefficient use of a limited and expensive resource. A Skyraider II at a fraction of that cost handles the same mission and reserves the 5th-generation aircraft for threats that actually require 5th-generation capability. Rounding out the replacement ecosystem are unmanned systems. The MQ-9 Reaper, itself now approaching retirement in favor of next-generation platforms, demonstrated across 2 decades that an armed drone with the ability to loiter for 24 or more hours, carrying Hellfire missiles and guided bombs, provides the persistent presence over a battlefield that no manned aircraft operating within normal crew duty limits can match. The emerging collaborative combat aircraft family, being developed under the Next Generation Air Dominance Initiative, promises to extend the reach of manned 5th and 6th generation fighters, with autonomous wingmen carrying weapons, sensors, and electronic warfare systems. None of these systems, individually or together, replicate what the A-10 does, but together they cover the mission space from multiple angles at varying cost and capability levels. What the Air Force is effectively arguing, and what the replacement ecosystem reflects, is that the future of close air support is not a single aircraft, but a layered system. Stealth fighters for denied airspace, low-cost propeller platforms for permissive environments, unmanned persistent assets for surveillance and precision strike, and autonomous wingmen to extend the manned aircraft's reach and survivability. The A-10 occupied a specific niche in that future construct, a medium threat environment where the enemy has some air defense capability, but not an integrated modern network, where loiter time matters, where the cannon is relevant, and where the aircraft's ability to absorb damage and keep flying changes the calculation for ground troops who are deciding whether to accept close air support risk. That niche is shrinking in the Air Force's view of future conflict, which is dominated by the near-peer scenarios of China and Russia, where none of those conditions apply. The Army's view of future conflict looks quite different, and the disagreement between those two institutional perspectives is ultimately what the retirement debate has been about for 30 years. The cost argument that drives the Air Force's urgency is not trivial. At approximately $11,000 to $17,000 per flight hour, depending on configuration and mission profile, each A-10C costs around $40 million annually in operations and support at typical flying hour rates. Maintaining 162 of them through the end of the decade under the phased retirement plan would represent several billion dollars in cumulative spending on a fleet that the Air Force believes contributes diminishing returns relative to the F-35s that money could procure or support instead. The $57 million accelerated retirement cost the service requested in its 2026 budget was, in the Air Force's math, a one-time investment that would return permanent operating savings exceeding that amount in relatively short order. Congress has consistently disagreed with the conclusion, if not the arithmetic, because Congress represents the Army's perspective and the ground troops' perspective in a way that Air Force budget submissions do not. The debate will not end cleanly. It never has. The history of the A-10 is the history of an aircraft that nobody wanted to build, everybody wanted to kill, and the people who actually needed it refused to let go of. It begins not with the airframe, but with a painful lesson that the United States Air Force was forced to absorb over the jungles and rice paddies of Southeast Asia. By the late 1960s, the American military had spent the better part of 2 decades optimizing its combat aircraft for nuclear weapons delivery and high-altitude supersonic air-to-air combat. The dominant design philosophy valued speed, ceiling, and range above all other parameters. Jets like the F-100 Super Sabre, the F-105 Thunderchief, and the F-4 Phantom were extraordinary performers within their design parameters. They were also almost entirely unsuited for the close air support of infantry and ground combat at low altitude in complex terrain. Their speeds made precise targeting difficult. Their turbojets were vulnerable to ground fire that piston engines could absorb. Their designs, optimized for high altitude, gave them poor maneuverability at the low speeds where close air support happened. Their maintenance requirements made sustained operations from forward bases nearly impossible to sustain over extended operations. In Vietnam, the mission was being flown by the Douglas A-1 Skyraider, a piston-powered propeller aircraft that had entered service in 1946. It was slow, loud, and ancient by jet age standards. It could carry more bombs than a B-17 Flying Fortress. It could loiter for hours. It could absorb machine gun fire and keep flying. Forward air controllers and the infantry they supported consistently ranked it as the preferred close air support asset in the war, and it was being retired. The Air Force recognized in the late 1960s that it had both a capability gap and a philosophical problem. The service had been organized, trained, and culturally shaped around high-performance jets and the nuclear and air superiority missions they flew. Close air support was the least prestigious assignment in the inventory, the least likely to attract investment in new dedicated aircraft. The gap the Skyraider's retirement would create was real, and the jets available to fill it were genuinely wrong for the role. In 1970, the Air Force issued the Attack Experimental Requirement, known as AX. The language was explicit and, by the standards of Air Force acquisition at the time, almost radical. The service wanted a purpose-built, subsonic jet attack aircraft optimized for close air support. It had to survive direct hits from ground fire. It had to be maneuverable, at low speed and altitude. It had to carry a substantial weapons load. It had to be simple to operate and maintain in austere forward conditions. And it had to be affordable to buy and operate in large numbers. This was not a requirement for a multi-role aircraft that could also fly close air support. It was a requirement for a specialist. A machine whose entire design was subordinated to one specific mission. The timing of the AX requirement coincided with a parallel development that would shape the aircraft more than any other single factor. The Air Force had also issued a requirement for a new heavy-caliber aircraft cannon capable of defeating Soviet tank armor from the air. The existing 20mm M61 Vulcan cannon carried by most American jet fighters was effective against aircraft and soft targets, but lacked the penetrating power to reliably defeat the frontal or side armor of the Soviet T-54, T-55, and T-62 main battle tanks then equipping Warsaw Pact ground forces in Europe. The Air Force wanted something bigger, a gun firing a larger caliber round at high velocity, with enough armor penetration to defeat Soviet armor from diving attack profiles. General Electric and Philco Ford were contracted to develop competing cannon designs, designated the GAU-7 for Philco Ford's caseless ammunition concept, and the GAU-8 for General Electric's conventional metallic cartridge design. The GAU-7 was eventually canceled, and the GAU-8 became the cannon the A-10 would be designed around. The decision to require the aircraft to carry this specific weapon, at this specific size, with this specific ammunition drum capacity, drove the entire architecture of the Fairchild Republic proposal, and explains why the YA-10A looked the way it did. Everything about the aircraft traces back to the decision that it would carry the GAU-8 Avenger, and that the GAU-8 Avenger would be as large and as capable as the technology of the early 1970s could make it. 6 defense contractors submitted proposals. The Air Force selected 2 for full-scale prototype development. Northrop's YA-9A was a conventional low-wing jet with engines buried in the fuselage. Clean lines, traditional layout, a recognizable military jet profile. Fairchild Republic's YA-10A was something else entirely. The engines were mounted externally in pods on the rear fuselage, high above and behind the wing. The wing was straight and low. The landing gear was oversized and robust. The cockpit sat far forward. The tail used 2 vertical fins rather than 1. The entire aircraft looked like it had been assembled from components meant for different vehicles. It was ungainly, it was inelegant, and it was engineered from the first rivet for exactly the mission the requirement described. Competitive trials at Edwards Air Force Base and Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona ran from October through December of 1972. Both aircraft flew simulated close air support profiles, weapons delivery runs, and low-altitude handling evaluations. On January 10, 1973, the Air Force announced that the YA-10A had won. Fairchild Republic received the full-scale development contract and began transforming the prototype into a production aircraft. The internal Air Force reaction was not uniformly enthusiastic. The fighter community that had always viewed close air support as secondary to air superiority and strike viewed the A-10 program with a combination of indifference and active resistance. Arguments emerged that the aircraft was too slow to survive a modern battlefield, that multi-role jets with appropriate weapons could perform the same mission, and that the money would be better invested elsewhere. These arguments lost the budget debate in the 1970s. They never went away. They formed the intellectual foundation of every retirement attempt made over the next 5 decades. Production A-10As differed from the prototype in several areas. The finalized installation of the GAU-8 Avenger drove significant design revisions throughout the forward fuselage. The gun drum required its own structural provisions. The centerline cannon mounting forced the nose gear offset. The ammunition feed system required routing through the lower forward fuselage. The gun and its associated systems together weighed close to 4,000 pounds and affected every weight and balance calculation across the airframe. The first production A-10A was delivered to the 355th Tactical Training Wing at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in March of 1976. The 354th Tactical Fighter Wing at Myrtle Beach Air Force Base in South Carolina achieved initial operating capability in October of 1977. Production continued through 1984, completing 713 aircraft, all single-seat A-10A variants, all for the United States Air Force, all remaining exclusively in American service throughout the aircraft's operational life. Cold War deployments centered on Western Europe. A-10 units stationed at RAF Bentwaters and RAF Woodbridge in England maintained rotating detachments at 4 forward operating locations in West Germany, Liefheim, Sembach, Norvenich, and RAF Allhorn, positioned to intercept the Soviet armor offensive through the Fulda Gap that NATO planners considered the most likely opening move of a major European war. The Warsaw Pact had armor advantages in Central Europe that NATO could not match tank for tank. The counter was air power at low altitude and high volume, delivered by aircraft that could operate from damaged or improvised forward bases and survive the ground fire that a major land war would generate. The tactics developed at those European bases through the late 1970s and early 1980s, low-level navigation, anti-armor employment, nap-of-the-earth flying, forward arming and refueling point operations, formed the practical foundation for everything the A-10 would later accomplish in combat. Operation Desert Shield began in August of 1990, and 7 A-10 squadrons with 144 aircraft deployed to Saudi Arabia to form the 354th Tactical Fighter Wing Provisional at King Fahd International Airport. For the pilots making that deployment, the coming war looked like the scenario they had trained their entire careers for: massed armor in open desert terrain demanding close air support from low altitude. Reality proved more complex, and the results more spectacular than even optimistic projections. Operation Desert Storm began on January 17, 1991. Over 43 days of air campaign and 100 hours of ground combat, A-10s flew 8,775 sorties and maintained a mission-capable rate of 95.7%, 5 full percentage points above the aircraft's peacetime maintenance rates. and extraordinary performance under combat conditions. The A-10 force was credited with destroying 987 Iraqi tanks, 926 artillery pieces, 1,355 combat vehicles, 2 Iraqi helicopters in air-to-air engagements with the GAU-8 cannon, and 10 Iraqi fixed-wing aircraft destroyed on the ground. A-10s fired 90% of all AGM-65 Maverick missiles employed during the entire conflict. In one of Desert Storm's most remarkable individual performances, Captain Eric Solomonson and Lieutenant John Marks of the 76th Tactical Fighter Squadron destroyed 23 Iraqi tanks in a single day. On the morning of February 25, the two pilots found a column of Republican Guard T-62 and T-72 tanks rolling south through the desert. They engaged with Maverick missiles and cannon fire, destroyed 15 tanks on the first pass, recovered to a forward operating location to rearm and refuel, and were immediately sent back out to support Marines under fire near Kuwait City. In the afternoon mission, they destroyed 8 more tanks in a fast engagement amid burning oil fields and smoke so thick it was difficult to see individual targets from altitude. Solomonson later described looking back at 8 tanks burning and exploding, ammunition cooking off, and thinking that for an A-10 pilot it simply did not get any better than that. In the broader Gulf War, approximately 70 A-10 aircraft sustained some form of battle damage, with 20 returning with significant damage requiring what would normally be depot-level repairs. Maintenance crews performed center wing replacements and outer wing work in the field under combat conditions, keeping aircraft flying that would have been written off as irreparable under peacetime procedures. 6 A-10s were shot down during Desert Storm. Captain Dale Storr was shot down by an SA-16 shoulder-fired missile on February 2 and captured, surviving to be repatriated after the ceasefire. 2 pilots were killed across the campaign. No other jet aircraft type in the American inventory had proven anything close to the A-10's combination of close air support effectiveness and raw survivability under fire. And yet, almost immediately after the war, internal Air Force planning began examining whether the aircraft was truly necessary for future conflicts. The Gulf War's air campaign had demonstrated the extraordinary capability of precision-guided munitions delivered by F-117 stealth fighters, F-15E Strike Eagles, and F-111 Aardvarks against Iraqi fixed targets. The airpower theorists inside and outside the Air Force used that demonstration to argue that the future of the battlefield lay in standoff precision weapons from medium and high altitude, rather than in the A-10's low-altitude gun and rocket engagement model. The aircraft had been designed for a war in Western Europe against Soviet armor that never came, its critics pointed out, and its Gulf War performance, while spectacular, had taken place against an Iraqi military that lacked the sophisticated integrated air defense network Soviet forces would have brought to Europe. The question of whether the A-10 could have survived those defenses was unanswered, and the Air Force used that unanswered question as the foundation of every retirement argument that followed. The first serious push to retire the A-10 came in the early Clinton administration. Defense budget reductions and the bottom-up review created pressure to cut force structure, and the A-10 was identified as a candidate for elimination. The Army, entirely dependent on the Air Force for fixed-wing close air support under the terms of the Key West Agreement of 1948, objected strongly. Congress blocked the retirement. The Warthogs survived Round 1. Operations Deliberate Force and Allied Force over the Balkans in the mid and late 1990s added more chapters to the A-10's combat record. In Bosnia, A-10s fired approximately 10,000 30mm rounds, enforcing United Nations protection zones and supporting NATO operations. In Kosovo, in 1999, A-10s flew hundreds of sorties against Serbian ground forces in a more demanding threat environment, including one where Serbian forces successfully downed an F-117 stealth aircraft with an older but well-employed SA-3 missile system. 2 A-10s were hit by Serbian missiles during Allied force. One made an emergency landing at Skopje Airport with an unexploded warhead in the aircraft. One returned to base with light damage. Both flew again. After September 11, 2001, the A-10 deployed to Afghanistan beginning in March of 2002 for Operation Anaconda, and maintained a continuous presence in the theater until the American withdrawal in 2021. The low-altitude maneuvering capability, the targeting pod, the loiter time, and the cannon that had been designed for Soviet armor proved equally effective against insurgent fighters in mountain villages, vehicle convoys on desert roads, and the complex urban combat that defined operations in Afghan cities. Between 2009 and 2012, A-10s flew between 27,800 and 34,500 combat sorties annually across Operation Iraqi Freedom and Operation Enduring Freedom combined, accounting for 32% of all combat sorties in both theaters. In the first half of 2013 alone, they flew 11,189 sorties in Afghanistan. From 2006 through October of 2013, A-10s conducted 19% of all close air support missions across Iraq and Afghanistan, more than the F-15E Strike Eagle and more than the B-1B Lancer, placing second only to the F-16 across the entire fleet. In Operation Iraqi Freedom beginning in March of 2003, 60 A-10 and OA-10 aircraft participated in the initial combat phase with a mission-capable rate of 85%, firing 311,597 rounds of 30mm ammunition across the operation. A single A-10 was lost, shot down by an Iraqi Roland surface-to-air missile near Baghdad International Airport. The pilot survived. In February of 2018, the A-10 participated in one of the most lopsided engagements of the post-9/11 era. Russian Wagner Group mercenaries and Syrian government forces, approximately 500 fighters supported by tanks, armored vehicles, artillery, and mortars, attacked a small base in eastern Syria holding American Special Operations Forces and Syrian Democratic Forces allies. Outnumbered by roughly 10-1, the Americans called for air support. For 45 minutes, essentially every available American combat aircraft in the region, F-15E Strike Eagles, B-52 bombers, AC-130 gunships, armed drones, and A-10s, took turns engaging the attacking force. The Wagner fighters had advanced without anti-aircraft weapons, apparently assuming the Americans would not respond with lethal force. When the engagement ended, an estimated 200 or more attackers were dead and dozens of vehicles destroyed. The A-10s that participated demonstrated, one more time, what the aircraft could do when the threat environment had been cleared, and what mattered was persistence, payload, and precision. The second major retirement attempt came in the fiscal year 2015 budget, when the Air Force requested authority to retire the entire fleet. The same arguments that had failed in the 1990s were now reinforced by a decade of F-35 development, finally approaching operational capability. The Air Force argued the A-10 cost too much to maintain, that its spare parts situation was deteriorating, that its survivability in future near-peer conflicts was essentially zero, and that the savings could be redirected to F-35 procurement. Congress blocked it again, attaching an explicit requirement that the Air Force demonstrate the F-35 could perform the close air support mission comparably before any A-10 could be retired. The Air Force never made that demonstration. Through the late 2010s and into the early 2020s, the retirement strategy shifted from direct elimination to gradual erosion. Spare parts procurement for retiring systems declined. Infrastructure investment at A-10 bases decreased. The oldest aircraft were retired first when Congress finally authorized modest initial retirements in fiscal year 2023. The fleet that had numbered over 300 aircraft at its Gulf War peak declined to 218 by the start of fiscal year 2024. 56 retired in fiscal year 2025, left 162. The Air Force's 2026 budget request sought authority to retire all remaining aircraft that year at a cost of $57 million, accelerating the original retirement timeline by 2 years. Congress pushed back once more. The Senate Armed Services Committee's 2026 draft budget prohibited the Air Force from reducing the A-10 fleet below 103 aircraft in fiscal year 2026, matching the previously agreed phase schedule. The National Defense Authorization Act further restricted retirement steps that would drop below that floor. As of early 2026, the legislative battle was ongoing, even as the aircraft whose retirement was being debated was flying live combat missions over the Strait of Hormuz. The full weight of that irony is difficult to overstate. The same week that congressional negotiators were writing statutory language to keep the A-10 alive past its preferred retirement date, American pilots were flying those aircraft in live combat, hunting Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps fast boats with precision and persistence that no available alternative could provide. The aircraft the Pentagon insisted was too old, too slow, and too vulnerable, had just shot down drones, destroyed surface targets, and was now providing maritime surface warfare capability in a strategically critical choke point at a cost per flight hour that made every competing platform look extravagant. The A-10 never asked to be loved. It is too ugly for that. Too loud on the ramp, too ungainly on the flight line alongside the sleek, swept-wing jets that the Air Force features in its recruiting materials, too associated with the close-in, ground-level violence of wars that air power theory prefers not to think about. But the soldiers, Marines, and special operators who called it in did not need air power theory. They knew what it meant when that specific sound, the signature groan and snarl of the GAU-8 spinning up, appeared overhead at the moment they needed it most. The saying in the ground force community is go ugly early. Call the A-10 before you need it, because once you need it, you may not have time to wait. That phrase captures something essential about the aircraft and about the relationship between the people who flew it and the people whose lives it saved. The Warthog is dying. The process has been underway since 2023, and no legislative action to date has stopped it, only slowed it. The aircraft that Congress has repeatedly saved from the Air Force's budget process is being sent to Davis-Monthan in batches, parked in the desert in the long rows of the boneyard alongside the other retired jets of American aviation history, preserved in the dry Arizona air, waiting for a future that will not come. Some will be cut apart for scrap, some will be preserved in museums. The ones that flew over the Strait of Hormuz in the spring of 2026, that carried Maverick missiles and APKWS rockets, and the kill markings of Shahed drones, will eventually find their way there too. The F-35A will perform close air support missions in the highest threat environments. The Skyraider II will support special operations forces from austere locations across Africa, the Middle East, and wherever else low-intensity conflict takes American forces. Unmanned systems will provide persistent overhead coverage in the spaces where fuel and crew endurance limits manned aircraft. The mission will continue, because the mission has always continued regardless of which aircraft flies it. There is a broader lesson in the A-10 story that the Air Force has been reluctant to fully absorb. The aircraft was designed for a specific threat that never materialized, the Soviet armor offensive through the Fulda Gap, and spent its entire operational life fighting completely different wars. Afghanistan was not Central Europe. Iraq was not the Red Army. The Strait of Hormuz is not the North German Plain. And in every one of those different conflicts, in every environment that differed from the one the aircraft was designed for, the A-10 proved not just adequate, but often irreplaceable. The lesson is that wars do not always look like the wars you prepared for, and that capability optimized for a specific kind of fighting, low altitude, high endurance, high payload, high survivability, low cost per flight hour, tends to find applications across a far wider range of scenarios than the design requirement anticipated. The Air Force has consistently argued that this lesson does not justify keeping the A-10. The Army and the ground troops who called it in have consistently argued that it does. That disagreement, institutional and doctrinal and never fully resolvable, is ultimately what the retirement debate is about. But there will not be another A-10. The Air Force decided in the 1980s that it did not want another purpose-built close air support aircraft. And it has not changed that position through 40 years of budget cycles, congressional battles, and repeated combat deployments that demonstrated the aircraft's irreplaceable value in the mission the institution preferred to dismiss. The aircraft that won the AX competition in January of 1973 will be the last aircraft in United States service designed solely and entirely for the mission of getting low and slow, putting weapons precisely on targets, and absorbing fire from people who very much want to stop it from doing so. The Warthog earned its retirement. It earned it over Iraq in 1991 when 2 pilots destroyed 23 tanks in a single day. It earned it over Kosovo and Bosnia. It earned it in Afghanistan over 2 decades of counterinsurgency. It earned it over Syria when Wagner mercenaries made a fatal miscalculation about what happens when you attack American forces without air defense. And it earned it one final time over the Strait of Hormuz in 2026, hunting fast boats in a war nobody predicted, in a role nobody planned for, with a weapons load and a loiter time and a cost per flight hour that made it the right aircraft for the moment, even as the retirement paperwork was being finalized. Go ugly early. The A-10 community lived by that phrase for 50 years. Now the ugly bird is flying its last combat patrols, and the Air Force that never fully loved it will spend the next generation figuring out how to replace something that was never really replaceable.